I remember watching a movie and missing half of what was being said. I'd have to rewind several times just to understand a single sentence. But
hello, English learners, and welcome to Speak English with Class, the podcast where language learning meets inspiration. I'm your host, Marco, and whether you're tuning in from your morning commute, a cozy corner of your home, or anywhere in between, we're here to make your English learning journey not just educational, but enjoyable. Each week, we dive deep into the experiences of real learners like you, exploring their triumphs, their struggles, and the strategies that help them succeed. We believe that learning English is more than just memorizing grammar rules or expanding your vocabulary. It's about connecting with others, embracing new opportunities, and expressing yourself in ways you never thought possible. So grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and let's dive into today's conversation. Today, we've got an incredible guest lined up who has navigated the highs and lows of learning English with resilience and creativity. She's here to share her story, packed with insights and the hard-earned wisdom that only comes from real experience. So without further ado, let's dive in. Please join me in welcoming Maria to the show.
hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Marco.
We're thrilled to have you. So Maria, let's get started. Can you tell us a little about where you're from and what initially sparked your interest in learning English?
Of course, I'm from Barcelona, Spain. And to be honest, English wasn't always a priority for me growing up. In school, it felt more like a subject I had to pass rather than something I genuinely wanted to learn. I remember sitting in English class and feeling overwhelmed by the grammar rules, the exceptions to those rules, and then the exceptions to the exceptions. It all seemed so complicated and I just couldn't see how it would be useful to me. But that changed when I started to realise how much English was around me. Whether it was watching movies, listening to music, or even scrolling through social media, English was everywhere. I began to feel like I was missing out on so much by not understanding it. And then, during a trip to London with my friends, I felt completely lost. I couldn't communicate effectively and it was frustrating. That trip was a turning point for me. I knew I had to take learning English more seriously.
I can imagine how eye-opening that must have been. So after that trip, what was your plan? How did you approach learning English?
When I got back from London, I was determined to improve my English. But honestly, I didn't know where to start. I knew that traditional methods, like just sitting down with a grammar book, weren't going to cut it for me. So I decided to approach it differently. The first thing I did was to immerse myself in the language. I started by watching my favourite movies and TV shows in English. At first, I used subtitles in Spanish, but gradually I switched to English subtitles, and then finally to no subtitles at all. It was tough though. I remember watching a movie and missing half of what was being said. I'd have to rewind several times just to understand a single sentence. But I kept at it because I knew that listening to native speakers was crucial for improving my comprehension. I also started listening to English songs and tried to sing along, even if I didn't understand all the words. Music became a fun way to practice pronunciation and learn new vocabulary.
That sounds like a fun and engaging way to learn, but I'm sure it wasn't all smooth sailing. What challenges did you face during this immersion phase?
Oh, there were definitely challenges. One of the biggest was the feeling of being overwhelmed. English has so many nuances, idioms, phrasal verbs, slang, and it felt like every time I learned something new, there was another layer waiting for me. I remember being particularly confused by phrasal verbs. They're tricky because they don't always make sense when you translate them directly. For example, I couldn't understand why give up meant to quit, or why bring up could mean both to mention something and to raise a child. It was confusing because I'd studied these phrasal verbs, but then I'd hear them used in different contexts and feel lost all over again. Another challenge was speaking. I was so afraid of making mistakes that I often hesitated to speak at all. I'd rehearse sentences in my head, but when it came time to actually say them, I'd freeze. My confidence was really low and I felt like I was stuck.
I think a lot of people can relate to that, being afraid to speak, because of the fear of making mistakes. Speaking of mistakes, do you have any funny language mix-ups you'd like to share?
There were plenty of moments. Once, I was trying to say, "I'm full" after a meal, but I accidentally said, "I'm full." My friends burst out laughing and started calling me fool for the rest of the day. Let's just say I learned the difference real quick.
That's hilarious. It's moments like those that make learning memorable. So how did you overcome the fear of making mistakes?
It took time, but I eventually realized that making mistakes was a necessary part of the learning process. I started small by talking to myself in English. I'd narrate my day, things like, "Now I'm making breakfast," or "I need to go to the grocery store." It sounds silly, but it helped me get comfortable with speaking without the pressure of someone listening. Once I felt more confident, I joined an online language exchange community where I could practice speaking with native speakers. At first, I was really nervous. I'd worry about sounding foolish or not being able to keep up with the conversation. But I quickly learned that people were patient and understanding. They knew I was learning, and they didn't expect perfection. In fact, they appreciated the effort I was making. That gave me the confidence to keep practicing, and over time, I noticed that my speaking skills improved significantly.
It's great to hear that you found supportive environments to practice in. Were there any specific strategies that helped you improve your speaking and listening skills?
Absolutely. One strategy that really helped was shadowing, where I'd listen to a short clip of native speakers and then try to repeat it exactly as they said it, mimicking their intonation, rhythm, and pronunciation. I found it incredibly useful because it forced me to pay attention to the details of how English is spoken. I'd often use clips from movies or TV shows because the dialogue felt more natural. For listening, I started incorporating podcasts into my routine. I'd listen to them while commuting or doing chores around the house. At first, I chose podcasts that had transcripts available so I could follow along and check any parts I didn't understand. Gradually, I moved on to podcasts without transcripts, and it became easier to follow conversations without needing to see the words. One thing I realized was that even if I didn't understand every word, I could usually get the gist of the conversation, and that was okay. Over time, the gaps in understanding became smaller.
Shadowing and using podcasts are excellent strategies. It sounds like you were really dedicated to improving your English. What about vocabulary? That's a big challenge for many learners. How did you tackle that?
Vocabulary was definitely one of the most challenging aspects for me. I'd learn new words, but then I'd forget them just as quickly. To tackle this, I started keeping a vocabulary journal. Every time I encountered a new word, whether in a book, a podcast, or a conversation, I'd write it down along with the sentence it was used in. That way, I could see how the word was used in context, which made it easier to remember. I also used a technique called spaced repetition. I'd review my vocabulary journal regularly, first after a day, then after a week, and then after a month. This helped to reinforce the words in my memory. But what really made a difference was actively using new words in my conversations. Even if I wasn't entirely sure I was using them correctly, I'd try to incorporate them into sentences. The more I used a word, the more natural it felt, and eventually it became part of my active vocabulary. Another fun strategy I used was to create associations with new words. For example, if I learned the word meticulous, I'd think of a meticulous person in my life, like my aunt who's always very detailed about everything. These associations help me remember the meanings of words better.
That's a great approach, using context and personal associations to make vocabulary stick. Were there any particular resources or tools that you found especially helpful in your learning journey?
Yes, there were a few resources that really stood out for me. One of them was an app called Anki, which uses spaced repetition to help you remember vocabulary. I created my own flashcards with the words I wanted to learn, and the app would prompt me to review them at intervals designed to optimize memory retention. It was really effective because it kept the words fresh in my mind without overwhelming me with too many at once. Another resource that I found incredibly useful was YouTube. There are so many great channels dedicated to English learning, covering everything from grammar to pronunciation to cultural nuances. I particularly enjoyed channels that focused on everyday English, like the phrases and expressions that native speakers use in casual conversation. These were often the things you don't find in textbooks, but they're so important for sounding natural in English. I also subscribed to English language newsletters and followed blogs that were written in English. This way, I was constantly exposed to the language in a variety of contexts, and it helped me see how English is used in different situations.
It sounds like you made the most of all the resources available to you. Now that you've made so much progress, what's your current strategy for continuing to improve your English?
Even though I've come a long way, I still consider myself a learner, and I'm always looking for ways to improve. One thing I focus on now is refining my understanding of more advanced aspects of English, like idioms and cultural references. These are the things that can make a conversation really come to life, but they're also challenging because they're not always intuitive. I continue to immerse myself in English as much as possible. I read books in English, watch English language news, and of course, listen to podcasts. I've also started writing in English more, whether it's journaling, writing emails, or even just posting on social media. Writing forces me to think carefully about the words I choose and how I structure my sentences, which has been great for reinforcing what I've learned. One thing that's been really helpful recently is joining a book club where we discuss books in English. It's a great way to practice speaking, and it also exposes me to new vocabulary and ideas. Plus, it's a lot of fun.
A book club sounds like a fantastic way to combine learning with social interaction. Before we wrap up, do you have any final tips or insights for our listeners who are still on their English learning journey?
Absolutely. The first thing I'd say is to be patient with yourself. Learning a language is a journey, and it's okay if you don't see immediate results. Consistency is key, so try to practice a little every day, even if it's just for a few minutes. Also, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Mistakes are how we learn, and every mistake you make brings you one step closer to fluency. Another tip is to find ways to make learning fun. Whether it's through music, movies, podcasts, or language exchanges, find something you enjoy and use that as your practice tool. When you're having fun, you're more likely to stick with it. Lastly, surround yourself with English as much as possible. Create an environment where English is a part of your daily life. Whether it's changing the language on your phone to English, following English-speaking influencers, or even talking to yourself in English. The more you immerse yourself in the language, the more natural it will become.
Those are fantastic tips, Maria. Thank you so much for sharing your journey with us today. Your story is truly inspiring, and I'm sure our listeners have gained a lot of insight and motivation from your experiences.
Thank you for having me, Marco. It's been a pleasure to share my story, and I hope it helps others on their own journeys. Remember, learning English is a journey, not a destination. Keep going, and you'll get there.
Absolutely. That brings us to the end of today's episode. Once again, a big thank you to Maria for sharing her incredible journey and valuable insights with us. I hope her story has inspired you and reminded you that every step forward, no matter how small, is progress. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe to Speak English with Class so you never miss out on more inspiring stories and practical tips. Until next time, keep learning, keep practicing, and keep speaking English with class. Take care.
Your progress doesn't end here. To continue advancing your English skills, click on the next video or explore the additional videos we've thoughtfully selected for you.